evening, everyone. I am Shahid Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of American Muslim Institution, AMI. For those of you newly acquainted with the organization, we're an organization focused on the improvement of the image of Muslims in the United States. Part of that mission involves engaging with media and opinion leaders. That strategy involves also engaging with the next generation of journalists, editors, and writers. We designed this program in 2019, pre-pandemic, feels like a generation ago, for students in the DC metro area. We took students to connect with opinion makers and journalists throughout the area, including New York and Washington, DC. Students had the opportunity to visit live tapings of the PBS NewsHour and Netflix's Patriot Act. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for many of them. I'll share a quick, unique story. We were being given a tour by Amna Nawaz of PBS's NewsHour, and during that actual tour, North Korea had launched missiles, and during that tour, she had to say, "Hey guys, I gotta go, we have breaking news." And I think that type of experience, putting people in a very adaptable field, is what we tried to do in 2019, and we're going to attempt to do something very similar in this virtual setting. In addition to Netflix and connecting with Hassan Minhaj and the New York Times and other institutions, they had the opportunity to visit think tanks and other companies engaged in forms of dialogue and communication with different audiences. This year, we're fully virtual, and we are excited to have selected 20 to 21 students from throughout the country. We had almost 100 applicants sign up to join this program. Some of the students are award-winning writers at their schools, writing for their local papers, running podcasts, and we even have a Fulbright scholar. To match this group of fantastic students and fellows, we have a distinguished lineup of speakers over the next 6 weeks. This 12-session program was designed to give a sense of the idea of the media sector, a very broad and wide sector. The topics covered include faith, the Arab Spring and Twitter, misinformation, and digital media. We have professors from Columbia and UMD discussing all of these topics, including journalists, award-winning journalists, producers, GMs, academics, and officials from the private sector. At AMI, we're strongly convinced that by building platforms like this to connect the next generation of journalists with the current generation of newsmakers, we can better ensure diversity and representation for all Americans. While this session is public, the remaining sessions will be more intimate and will provide an opportunity for participants to directly connect with the subject matter experts on a deeper and a more personal level, having their questions answered and insights revealed. I have many more things to say about AMI and the program, but I know everyone here, including our participants, are here to hear from our guest speaker and hear from their insights and experience. To our 2021 fellows, there'll be a quiz at the end of the program. Just kidding. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by AMI board member Kassar Sharif. Kassar has been on the board of AMI since its founding in 2015. His professional background is from the consumer goods industry, where he worked at Procter & Gamble for about 30 years in various senior capacities in the US and overseas, taking early retirement in 2011. Since then, he has taught as an adjunct faculty at GW University Business School in 2015 and 2016, and has published a memoir of his professional life, When Tribesmen Came Calling, Blue Year Books in Seattle. For the last couple of years, in addition to serving on boards of several nonprofits, he has been writing a bi-weekly column focused on current affairs in the US and globally. Kassar is based in Washington, DC, and he is looking forward to getting us started. Kassar, could you mind turning on your camera?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Shahid. Can I go now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for keeping it relatively short. It's my pleasure and honor to be the moderator for this session. We have, as Shahid already said, a very distinguished panel of speakers who interestingly come from very different backgrounds, and I'm going to introduce all of them. And again, before I even do that, my apologies because they have such illustrious and distinguished backgrounds. I've had to choose just little snippets from their background so that we don't spend half the session introducing the speakers. So I'll start with our first panelist, Kristie Gonzalez. She's Vice President of Media Operations at Tegna Incorporated and President and General Manager of KVUE, the Tegna-owned television station and ABC affiliate in Austin, Texas. In the last 2 years, KVUE has won 10 Emmy Awards and numerous AP Awards and grown monthly active digital users by 24%, averaging more than 4 million users per month. Prior to joining KVUE, Kristie held various TV management roles across the country, including most recently promotion and digital manager at WABC in New York City. Next is Raju Naresetti, and please forgive me if I didn't pronounce your last name exactly right. He's a publisher at McKinsey Global Publishing at McKinsey Company, a well-known consulting firm. Prior to this role, Raju was professor of professional practice and director Knight Bagehot Fellowships at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. And before that, he has been CEO of Gizmodo Media. And prior to that, he was Senior Vice President, Growth and Strategy at News Corporation, a well-known media entity, of course. Last but not least is Marcellus Alexander, Jr., former president of the National Association of Broadcasters Leadership Foundation, where he's a director since 2019. Mr. Alexander is the former executive vice president of television at the National Association of Broadcasters. Alexander is a seasoned media executive with more than 40 years of experience in broadcasting, communications, and government relations. Prior to his work at the NAB, Alexander served as vice president and general manager at local television stations in Baltimore and Philadelphia. Believe me, these are the very, very abbreviated versions of their bios, but hopefully gives the audience enough of a feel of the kind of distinguished panel that we have here today. So again, thank you to all the panelists for giving us their time, giving AMI and our attendees their time and their expertise for today's discussion. The topic for this session is business of media. Now, very broad topic, and Shahid and I were discussing exactly how we want to really approach this topic, and we jotted down a few things. So I'm going to kick us off with a question that I will pitch to all the panelists, and we can go around and speak to this, and then we can kind of pick up from there. So my first question is, what do we mean by media, and how do we define it, and how do we see it? Maybe we can start with Ms. Gonzalez, and then we'll go around with Raju and Marcellus after that. Please go ahead.
So don't make fun of me because I just Googled it while you said that. I was like, what if they go to me first? Because, you know, the basic definition, it's such a broad word. And I think that's probably why we're asking the question, because it's mass communication, right? And that's what we're on the business of on this panel. And so when I think of media, I'm just going to be selfishly personal about it, because for us, media is really video first, and then the written word via digital. So those are the two main areas that we distribute content. And of course, there's so many other areas it goes to, but we really, for Tegna, the company I work for, we're all in on video as our main media source and way of getting out our mass communication.
Okay, thank you so much. Marcellus, how do you see it? Especially in this changing world of what is media. I mean, before I'm out of bed in the morning, I've already read through headlines from so many different entities versus the way the world used to be back in our day, as they say.
Right. Well, picking up on what Kristie mentioned, it is the broadest of terms. When you start drilling down on it, of course, it is broadcast, television and radio. It is print. It is the internet. It is publishing on all platforms. It is music, movies. It's also social media apps and advertising. And all of that, as Kristie mentioned, is communication. It's mass communication. And one of the challenges, and I'm looking forward to talking about this in this session, many people in the public think of media as one thing, one entity. And clearly, particularly when it comes to news gathering and news dissemination, there couldn't be further differences between some of those media that I just described. But it is a wide swath of communication that makes up that word that we call media, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. Raju, what do you say?
Given the nature of our audience here, a lot of them from mostly from news media, I'm going to narrow it down just to kind of talk about the definition of news media. Historically, it's just been a group of professionals who come together, usually under a news brand at a company, whose primary role and mission has been to cover news and bring that to larger audiences. And so there are typically standards around that, typically kind of focus on covering news events. Of course, there's some opinion and other content around that. These days, as Marcellus and Kristie have said, it can be used for pretty much anything where information is being shared. It feels like, given the audience that's in this session, a lot of them probably are interested in more about news media.
Okay, thank you very much. You know, I think between what all of you have said, essentially is that it's a very, very broad range of things that we refer to as media. And in fact, oftentimes people just throw out the term, you know, media is doing this or isn't doing that and so on. I mean, what does that really mean anymore? Let me just pick up from differences between local versus cable versus national media. And also, if you could contrast a little bit what goes on in electronic media, which is broadcast electronic media, versus a little bit, you know, the kind of media we all have access to on the phones that are in our pocket. Kristie, would you like to start us off on that?
Sure. And, you know, I kind of pitched this question too, because I think it's really important when we talk about media to understand the differences. And since this panel is about business models, I'm just going to dive into kind of my view of that, which is I've spent my whole career in local news on the, of course, television broadcast side, right? And that, as Marcellus can tell you, is very regulated by the FCC. So we have rules for the privilege of having our tower that we broadcast for free to audiences. And there are a lot of rules and there are a lot of regulations that include a lot of paperwork, but it means that your local news talent, when they report, they are expected to be unbiased. We are not supposed to have commentary or points of view in our reporting, and that's the basic expectation that sometimes gets violated. And I think the reason why it's getting violated more recently is because we've watched our cable media brethren do things that are more, have a business model that's based on confirmation bias. So obviously, if you pick a psychology of belief that somebody holds, you can craft the point of views that you're doing on your cable channel, and you don't have the same regulation that we do in local media. So I know we have, I tried to look at who is on this panel, the fellows that are in this group, and I think we have representation from all those medias, but it's very different being in local broadcast than it is in cable. We're not supposed to have a point of view. And I would say also in public media, it also gets different, though I have less experience there. And I would add too, that when your public media is government funded, that's a whole nother set. You know, if we look at the business model of the BBC, that's totally different expectations if you're fundraising versus ad supported. So that's just a little tiny little sprinkling of the business models from my perspective.
Okay, thank you so much. You know, maybe Marcellus, maybe you can jump in again. I'll pick up on something that Kristie just said about not expectation of not having a bias, which is almost a novelty anymore. I think when you think of all the media that comes at us, how do you look at that versus advocacy and so on? That is probably a vast majority of what we broadly consider media.
Well, let me make one important distinction, and it's again based on something that Kristie said. There is a clear difference between a journalist and an opinion host. And what Kristie was referencing is that in local news, local broadcast stations, those are journalists, and they are held to that standard, as she mentioned, by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. On the cable side, there are not those same requirements, and they certainly do offer a heavy dose of opinion. And what makes it a little bit further confusing to the viewer, there can be a cable channel that has more news-focused journalists on a few shows, but then on that same channel, perhaps later in the day or in the evening, there are opinion hosts clearly offering their opinions and offering their advocacy and everything else that they might do. And education of viewers to understand the sources that they're receiving their content from is an ongoing challenge that we have to really protect our democracy. People have to understand and be able to decipher, where am I getting news, as unbiased as it might be, versus opinions, and make my decisions based on obviously, hopefully, the facts, and that's how that works. But in terms of bias, we all have biases. We all have our own baggage that we bring to the table, if you will. But journalists are supposed to check that baggage at the door, present the facts, both sides or all sides, and allow the viewers to make their own determinations. And what happens, and Kasir, you mentioned this at the top, people refer to the media and they say, what's the media doing, and so forth. Their interpretation of the media is, of course, based on what they are watching. And there may be 2 or 3 different platforms that are being expressing opinions or presenting facts, but they all get clumped together as quote unquote the media, which is very confusing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. Raju, would you speak a little bit to this whole notion of unbiased journalism versus opinion, which, like you said, most cable channels, even news channels, have both of those things. And sometimes the programming is in and out of one versus the other, somehow expecting the viewer will be able to decipher between them. How do you see that, and where is this headed as you see it, or how is it impacting things?
Yeah, Kaiser, actually, both the questions you've asked, one around the definition of local versus national, and the other one around the distinction between news and views, actually both have been significantly disrupted by technology in the last 20, 25 years, right? If you think about traditional media, it was always dictated by who you reach, was always dictated by where your printing plant was, what was the capacity of your transmission tower, and what was the radio frequency you had. So that defined who you could reach. So that defined local versus non-local. You couldn't reach other audiences. Similarly, in print and especially in print and even in broadcast television, there were segments that were clearly labeled as, in print, it was an opinion section and a news section. It was very clear they didn't, obviously, in print, they don't blend in some ways, even though they're next to each other. Similarly on TV, what changed fundamentally was the coming of the internet. The internet made all these distinctions very blurry, right? I mean, when I get up late in the morning, I don't listen to my NPR station in New York. I start with KPCC in LA because that's 3 hours behind. Now on the internet, that's my local station actually, right? Similarly, I can read, I used to work in Dayton, Ohio. So if I want to, I can read the Dayton Daily News on the internet, right? So is the Dayton Daily News a local paper? Yes. But is it reach international, global? Absolutely. Very similarly, a lot of the techno stations have websites, and I can go and access them, right? So I think that the definitions have become really blurry, which is both good and bad. Similarly, I think social media and platforms have made it very difficult to keep the distinction between news and views, because if the Wall Street Journal's Twitter handle sends something out, unless you click on it, go to their website, and see that it is in a section called opinion, you don't necessarily automatically realize it's opinion, because a tweet could just have the same headline as a news story was. So I think this is where our industry has gotten into trouble, and people have come in and said, oh, if the lines can be blurry, why don't we take advantage of it? And business models have come about to kind of make it even more blurry. And so you're hard to tell which is news and which is opinion because the labels don't carry on the internet. So I think these are the issues that we are all grappling with. Aren't any easy answers. I mean, you could argue at a very high level, a national broadcaster that calls itself Fox News, a lot of it is opinion, right? So you could say the name itself begins the confusion. So I think there are just lots of ways to think about it. And a lot of it is being driven by the fact that audiences can be anywhere and they can consume you in formats you didn't necessarily envision when you created this separation between news and opinion.
Okay, thank you so much. So it seems like, among other things, that the growth of technology, internet technology, the ability to access media from any part of the country, any part of the world, is really having a big impact in how local versus national is viewed, and at the same time, the whole distinction between news versus opinion, news versus views is all kind of blurring. Somebody sent me an app which has a map of the world, and I can, it's called Radio Garden, and I can touch any point in there, and I can pick up a radio station from that part of the world, and I can start to listen to it. It's amazing, and I don't even know how many tens of thousands of radio stations there must be around the world, but just having that at your fingertip is, to me, quite mind-boggling. So, beyond technology, one of the other things that's happening, which perhaps was happening even before there was this technological turmoil, was consolidation in media entities. And in the kind of traditional sense, companies buying each other and so on, but also across platforms and so on. I would just, any one of you can jump in there and say a few words about how do you see this? Are we looking at the rise of media monopolies? And what are implications for media and particularly balanced coverage going forward?
Well, I'm happy to start that part of the conversation. Clearly, there's consolidation. There are, depending on how you shape and look at the media, about 6 corporations control about 90% of the media outlets in America. But one of the fallacies, I think, to that becoming a big problem is that the thought that that will cause less diversity of voice, less opinions, less coverage of news, and so forth. The reality is, if I owned 100 television stations, I have to be competitive and attract viewers to my stations. And even if I have 2 or 3 in one market, I am going to have to differentiate the content on those stations to attract viewers. I can't do that if they are all just cookie cutter versions of each other. I've got to be able to produce and present content that is relevant, that is going to engage them so that I can make the business model work. So I think it requires scale these days to compete in the business of communications against all of the other media that's out there, all of the other platforms and sources that I mentioned at the top. And that scale helps the negotiation with content producers, with broadcast networks, with other suppliers of equipment. It requires that type of scale to really succeed in those businesses. And the other side of that coin is to have, and there are some very successful small operators, right? They might own 10 television stations or 3 or 4. The other side of that is those stations may have a difficult time creating the content, supporting the community with good, strong news teams and that type of thing. So you can have a smaller station with that separate viewpoint, but that station has a difficult time competing against the others in the marketplace. So scale is important. Differentiation of product is very important. And certainly being relevant and attracting the eyeballs and ears to the content is critical to success.
Thank you. One of the things you mentioned, differentiation, and I think I was not so engaged with media at the time other than a consumer, but the whole, I think it used to be that a TV station used to have to look at other TV stations in their market to see who their competition was. And now anybody is your competition, including people who don't know anything about anything, but are tweeting day and night. I come from a consumer goods background where very different from media, where at Procter & Gamble, we were very used to having 3 brands of bar soap or 3 brands of dish liquid. And it was almost down to a science as to how the brands are different from each other. And in terms of what they offer, in terms of the target audience, in terms of their prime prospect, any brand could give you a complete rundown of how do they look at the world that they are competing in. So Kristie, maybe I can ask you, when you look across the market that you are in, who do you consider your competition, and how do you think about it, and how do you look at it, and how do you even plan for it in this sort of an environment?
Yeah, and I'll preface this with most of my career has been in local. So I'm going to, again, share that lens. So for us at KVUE, our competition is still the other networks in town that are doing local broadcasting. And it's Austin. So everybody pretty much has a newsroom because it's a good size market. So they are definitely our competition, but so is the Statesman, that's a local newspaper. And so is Texas Tribune, that operates out of Austin and covers Texas politics and other things like that. And then not to mention the startups in the news space. We have one called Austonian and some other ones. So we're all competing for share of voice with Central Texas and the eyeballs and clicks here. Although that 4 million, if we have 4 million unique visits every month, that's obviously double the population, right? So we know we're pulling from outside of the market too, but we really want to base our business on loyalists and having repeat monthly active users from the beautiful city that you see behind me who want to consume KVUE. And so that's where we lean into, and it allows us to be also really specified in the type of news we cover. Like what works in Austin is not necessarily going to be the thing in DC or Raju. I don't know where you live right now. Someone's in Jersey. People here love business stories and growth stories and traffic stories because we are a literal boom town. So that's something that works here in Austin and allows us to be very local with our business model and kind of have a brand on the competition of just focusing on what's important to people here.
Thank you very much. Let's move to Raju. Raju, again, picking up on the thread of differentiation and so on, but also ultimately it relates to the financial model that the different media entities have. How do you see the evolution of media, the impact of technology and so on impacting the financial model that media entities have to be worrying about and thinking about? And how does, anyhow, let me stop there and then I'll sort of pick up further from there.
Just to start off with the consolidation question, it feels like it's had different impacts on different kinds of media, right? If you look at the traditional news, print and digital media, the US is in particular has kind of really bifurcated into the big 3, which I would say are the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And there's a bit of a struggling middle, whether it's the Boston Globe or the Dallas Morning News, which are now increasingly part of the consolidation that's happening. And there's a really group of smaller papers that have dramatically consolidated as part of larger chains. And there the questions have been around this idea of news deserts, as in like large parts of the country may not have the traditional media anymore. But the same forces that are driving these changes, which is the business model changes that are leading to consolidation, are also allowing for, Kristie mentioned a couple of examples, are also allowing for people to start a lot of new media outlets, right? I mean, it used to be that if you wanted to start something, a media outlet, you had to first invest in a printing plant. That was a pretty high barrier for new people to come in, which meant that existing folks had a lot of monopoly for a long time. But again, thanks to the internet, thanks to all of the platforms that have come, it doesn't take a lot of resources to launch a hyper-local site. It's a different matter that whether you sustain it and grow it, it remains a challenge. But at least getting it off the ground and providing alternatives to people in a particular city are now that much more easier to do. And you're seeing a proliferation of that as well. So consolidation is causing some interesting challenges and trends, but at the same time, you're seeing a big boom in 2 or 3 people deciding to leave a newspaper and saying, you know what, there's a market here, we will set up a website. The other new phenomena that's happened, particularly in the US, is a lot of nonprofit foundation money has come into media. It never used to be the case. Just to give an example, between 2010 and 2015, nonprofit foundations put in about 83 million into media, which might seem a lot, but it's 1% of the 8.3 billion in advertising revenue we lost to the tech platforms. So it's actually a pretty small amount. But since then, there have been significant investments. A lot of wealthy people seem to have decided that they want to invest in media, whether it's Bezos for the Washington Post and others. So there are both positive and negative trends to what's happening in terms of sustainability and the challenges of the business models. I think the big questions are, has anybody figured out a particular model that we can say, okay, this is going to be sustainable, this is replicable? I think everybody is trying. It has been an uphill battle when you're dealing with Google and Facebook and some of these behemoths who have taken a lot of advertising dollars away. But the subscription models seem to be working for a few people. Propensity to pay for good content seems to be increasingly becoming bigger. So as a result, I think I am generally hopeful and optimistic about the future of media, not necessarily the future of existing companies per se or brands, but the fact that people forget that only 60% of the world's population is on the internet on a daily basis as of now, right? That means another 2 to 3 billion people are going to come on the internet in the next, let's say, 10 years. So the demand, and even if a fraction of them consume news, the demand for news has never been larger in the history of news since the invention of the Gutenberg press than it is today, and it'll be even bigger tomorrow. Literally every day, the demand is going up. So the people who can supply it are in a very good position. It's a matter of like figuring out business models, but the demand is there. So I'm generally pretty optimistic.
Okay, no, excellent. So
may I pick up on one point that he was making relative to the low barrier of entry for these new outlets? I would totally underscore the importance of that and the trend that is. Today, there are influencers in any number of different categories, from clothing to fashion to food, and they have large followers that really do move product and commerce. And those influencers are taking pieces of the pie that were for traditional media, and that's not a bad or a good thing. That's just reality. And the smarter, better run stations are finding ways to create partnerships with those influencers to bring in some of that audience to the traditional and have that hybrid model that really does attract and is sustainable. So I would just underscore that point that Raju made, that that low barrier of entry, Kristie and I could start a station tomorrow. I'm not sure how many people would watch us, Kristie, but we could start one and get, depending on the content that we have, create a following and become influencers and sought after in terms of advertising product and that type of thing. It's a real important.
So it seems like there are many countervailing forces at play. There's consolidation, and maybe that's in reaction to the low barrier to entry or the other way around. But one thing is for sure, that the business model of sustainability of a media entity is rapidly evolving, and it is having an impact on so many things. But how is it affecting the ethics of reporting, or the pressure to be non-biased and so on? I mean, Kristie, maybe you can say a couple of words about that from where you sit. And we know that the lens through which you are looking at things, but how do you see that in this evolving scenario?
Well, I think, 10 years ago, and I had the pleasure to work for Disney for a decade and watch what happened at ESPN and others, right? Because we all thought we needed to move more toward opinion or having a point of view. And meanwhile, locals trying to stay out of it, right? Like, don't touch us. We know what we need to do. The FCC tells us the way we should be. And so you have digital that where you could get scores on anything. And so you're not going to do that on TV because it's boring TV. So I guess what we need to do is opinion, but now that's losing traction too. So I would just say, that all of this is still working itself out. And especially as we saw in the last political season, the last 4 years, really 5, 6 at this point, where we had so many more people in the middle politically that had more in common. And, if you look at the data, you can watch it just over the last decade go like this and split us into sides, right? And social media had a lot to do with that. Media had a lot to do with that, right? Because we all chose our echo chambers to listen to and get further and further away from each other. So and this is kind of coming from a millennial point of view of, I think we're also going to start to pull away from some of that opinion and the things that separate us, because we're just kind of sick of it. I know I'm sick of it. I want to celebrate with my brothers and sisters, especially now that we're coming back in public. So I don't think that pendulum is done swinging yet when it comes to, are we going to change to opinion? Are we going to keep bias? Look, in what everybody does on this panel, if you don't have integrity, you're not going to have a brand. If you don't set clear standards on truth and what is opinion and what's not, you're just doing a lot of damage to your brand. And so that's really what you have to hold, no matter which kind of media you're a part of. So that's kind of where I'm at. I don't think the pendulum's done swinging there. I really don't.
No, I agree. And you were saying that if you don't have the ethics, you will do damage to your brand. I sincerely hope that is the case. And sometimes I wonder, because people are pushing the envelope, pushing the limits of what used to be considered ethical journalism. Maybe Raju and then Marcellus, maybe you guys can comment on that, particularly in the light of the rapidly changing, rapidly evolving scene, how this is impacting the ethics of media, or it may impact the ethics of media.
I mean, journalism, the ethics have always been built around codes of conduct and a style guide and codified practices at different brands, right? There isn't really a US journalism code of conduct. There are organizations, professional organizations that have one, and individual brands have one. And that hasn't really changed, right? I mean, all of the major brands still have it, whether it's the Gannett. The fact that ownership of Gannett or other papers come into Gannett and go out of Gannett doesn't mean that they don't follow their standards. Similarly, the Wall Street Journal, all of these papers haven't really changed their standards. If anything, one could argue these standards are actually too rigid and they have not accommodated the changes in digital dissemination. They're struggling to deal with young journalists wanting to also express an opinion while still being part of a brand. You're seeing a lot of those tensions really come about. So I don't think that has really changed. What has happened, though, is the ability for entrepreneurs, journalists, ex-journalists, content creators to really start catering to biases, to kind of say, if you're interested in a point of view, I can create a brand for you and will feed you more and more of that. And you think that that is the universe of news. So the inability of mainstream media to kind of get people to look at multiple views, especially on digital platforms, I think has done a disservice in creating this idea that somehow journalism has become less ethical. I don't think the majority of journalism is any less ethical. If anything, like I said, I think they're a little bit too hidebound sometimes in their codes of conduct. So I don't think it's an ethics issue. I think the proliferation of outlets that can cater to very niche needs and not necessarily think about all the ramifications of that, I think that's what is causing the perception. And clearly there's a decline in trust. And I think that's feeding into each other.
Okay, thank you. Marcellus, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think companies have to ask themselves two questions at the start. Who are we and who do we want to be? And for Scripps, the company that I'm on the board of directors for, that company, which has been in existence for over 140 years, has from day one answered that question with this mantra. Their mantra is give light and people will find their own way. It is a journalism-based mantra, and that company throughout the stations and all the businesses that are under that Scripps umbrella live, breathe that every day. There's never a question as to should we do something to the left, should we do something to the right? No, that's not even a conversation. It's not even in the dialogue. We're going to be a journalism first organization through whatever platform we use, be it television, internet, social media, whatever it is, we're going to be journalism first. One of the things, and this is a challenge that the entire industry has, of course, is the challenge of disinformation and misinformation, because at the end of the day, those factors are causing a lot of doubt, a lot of questioning about whether the media is accurate or not. And as an industry, we have to find a way, or continue to find ways, to re-strengthen that core competency of our industry, and that is solid journalism, present the facts, leave the bias for the other guys, but that's something that we have to do. And news literacy, again, as I mentioned earlier, is one of those areas that we have to do more and invest more so that people understand, know your source, understand if you're getting facts or opinion, and govern your lives based on whichever of those that you choose. But the code of ethics of, again, truth and accuracy, independence, fairness, those are traits that the better run companies, Tegna being one of them as well, embrace as they present their news product. Because without that credibility, we are in a world of trouble. Our democracy is in a world of trouble. And my hope is that we can course correct from where we are now, because that disinformation and misinformation is rampant.
I was going to add a discussion we've had in our newsroom this last week on what Marcellus is talking about. If we take statements from officials right from their Twitter account or their Facebook page, and we don't get the ability to ask them questions about it or press them or, just fact check them, and we just show their statements on screen, we're missing that part of journalism where we ask the important questions that need to be asked or even fact check them, and so we also have to be careful with something that small of like, hey, the police chief said this on Twitter, and then that's all. We don't get the opportunity to follow up or do more on that.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Kaiser, if I may jump in here a little bit.
Yeah, please.
I think the challenge is looming for organizations that are struggling on the business side and don't have the resources to invest in the right amount of journalism. And I think that's where people can take advantage of it, right? I mean, if a pharma company knows that you don't have a lot of resources in your newsroom, and they're saying, hey, we have 90-second clips on these healthcare series, and it's ready to use, and you take it and run it, but behind the scenes, the pharma company has a point of view and it's pushing a particular agenda. And I think that's where the business model challenges can sometimes allow for opportunistic kind of folks to take advantage of it. I think you're seeing a little bit of that, and we just need to watch for that.
Okay, no, thank you. Moving on to a slightly another aspect of this whole thing. I think Kristie said earlier that we are all sort of receding into our own echo chambers, and that is happening across the society. And whether developments in social media are driving it, or whether this desire on part of humans is driving social media, we don't know, and frankly, doesn't matter. But so there is this trend. On the other hand, there's also a lot of desire or push for a diversity of opinions. And so how do these two play against each other? And also, is there any evidence that having a diversity of opinions in an echo chamber run world actually helps the bottom line or the financial viability of an entity? Kristie, maybe you can pick up on that.
I mean, I feel like you just asked us the question that everyone faces at their dinner table when they go and hang out with their family for whatever big celebration, right? How do we all feel when we're at that table with all these different opinions going on? And most of us don't have the language of listening where we're able to like stop and take it in. So it's really hard. And so I think that's why, like, as I think about that problem that you just brought up, we're leaning into here are the facts, right? And you are the judge of how you want to interpret that. Kind of to what Scripps' mission is, right? Like, we shine the light and you figure it out. That's where we're locally like just moving, because that's a big question that you're asking.
Mhm. Sure. Raju, do you want to say anything on that? Again, just to repeat the thing, and maybe we can continue to also move it along, this whole societal trend of people receding into their echo chambers, so to speak, and also at the same time, so much pressure or demand for diversity of opinion.
That is the struggle that I don't think most of us have good answers to. How do we get people who are left of center reading something from right of center? How do we get the people who haven't formed an opinion to consider reading multiple places and then forming an opinion? I think in a very time-pressed world that we are increasingly dealing with, that's the struggle that I don't think we have effectively answered as an industry. Two, as I said earlier, I think our inability to kind of figure out how to label things so that the label always carries with the piece of content, we've just not figured that out, right? Meaning that, like I said, a page of opinion in print is sitting in a page of opinion. There's nothing contaminating it, if you will. But the moment it travels, the moment it becomes a tweet, the moment it goes to Facebook, that environment is no longer a controlled environment and labeled environment. And I don't think we have ceded that issue to the platforms, and I don't think we know how to get that back. And then on diversity, I think there's no other side to truth. There's other side to an opinion, but it can't be that there's somebody else has a different version of the truth. And I think that's where there has been some slippage, if you will, in allowing an opinion and a point of view, but that's using facts that are actually not really facts to make that opinion. I think there's been some blurring of lines there. And on the diversity point, I actually have a opposite view here, Kaiser, which is that I think the media industry should take a lot of blame for the lack of trust, because for a long time now, our newsrooms have not reflected the society we want to write about and our audiences. And that imbalance has led people to kind of disbelieve what's coming out of that news brand and out of the newsroom, because when you look at the people writing, or when you look at a particular broadcast, if everybody looks a certain kind and the market you're serving is very heterogeneous, and the news industry, I think, is really behind on that curve, right? Whether it's Black, Hispanic, or Native American groups in reporting, in editing, in leadership, long way to go, big gaps. And so some of the trust deficit has been actually self-inflicted.
Okay.
Well,
Marcellus,
and remember,
yeah.
Sorry,
ahead,
just
please.
to riff on what
Go
you're
ahead.
saying, like, we have millennials are more diverse, right? And they're entering our newsrooms in droves, and we expect to see diversity at the table. But then when we look at our management, and you look at people in my position, and only 20% of them are women, and 8% are people of color. Not to mention, like, when you get to Asian populations, the big umbrella, right? We're talking like under 1%. So you have this diversity around you that you're growing up in, but like all above, you don't even know if you can question things, because like, who at that level even understands your point of view at all? So that's, we really have to keep pressing on. It's just the diversity at the top. We have to like fast forward that.
Marcel, let me ask you, just kind of picking up on what Kristie just said, is that just a matter of time, that it will happen with time? Or is there something more that is needed? And how will that impact the changes that we are desirous of, or lack of those changes, how will those impact the bottom line?
Right. So
Entities?
it is a matter of time, but it is also a matter of continuing to focus and apply pressure, or stated a different way, hold leaders accountable for diversity, equity, and inclusion. This category, this subject is obviously getting a lot of attention throughout the country, thanks to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and a lot of other social unrest. But there is time, yes, it takes time, but it's also going to require a focus, pressure, and holding, again, people accountable and having metrics that you can measure, because otherwise things don't tend to happen as quickly as they need to. Most stations would vocalize and articulate that they believe it's important that their newsroom reflects the communities that they serve. But there's still a lot of work to be done in that space. Typically, you'll see some pretty fair amount of diversity on air, the folks that are in the anchor desks and reporters. But as Kristie was mentioning, when you go to the general managers, the news directors, executive producer levels, there is not the diversity that is needed there. And to your primary point, Kasir, the business case for diversity has been made in a number of different places. In fact, McKinsey has done a number of studies that show, not only McKinsey, but other companies as well, that show there is a clear benefit, a clear and unchallenged benefit to having a diverse team, and how it performs much better than a homogenous team. So people who are who don't understand that reality perhaps should get some of these studies, get them out in McKinsey and whoever else, because it is clear, and that is something that you just it's going to require us all, again, to push forward and again expect positive change, because that's what it's going to take.
Okay, thank you. There's one question that is just in the back of my mind, and it may not have been on the list of things that we wanted to, but I really, worry about the financial viability of print media. Newspapers and magazines have been in a certain way, and I subscribe to probably half a dozen newspapers and maybe more than that, just because I want to stay connected to them. And in half the cases, I really don't have to subscribe. I could probably get enough out of them just through, signing up on their various kind of feeds that they send out. Where do you think that is headed? Where do you think print media is going to go? I don't know. Maybe Marcel, if we have you on the screen here, maybe you can start and share your thoughts, and then we can go to
Sure. Well, there's no question that print media is challenged, right? Because the internet and people are receiving their print content through the internet. I think that ultimately, for that platform to succeed, they're going to have to include video. They're going to have a much more robust digital strategy. Content is always critically important. And the things that we've been talking about, making sure that the content is reflective of the community, reported on by people who look like those in the community, all of those things tend to pay dividends downstream. But it is, and one of the key things, again, I think, and I know that Kristie's station here in Austin does this, creating partnerships with other outlets, where the Austin American Statesman and KVUE have a partnership. Any kind of creative thought that brings the newspaper and its digital assets and its reporting assets to other media that is more popular at this point, I think would be something that they should consider. And I know that many of them are considering that.
Okay, we're kind of closing in on time, but a question has just been sent to me, and I want to read that off to you folks and see whoever wants to respond. In practical terms, the biggest casualty of the evolution that's going on in media is trust, largely because of the high degree of bias in different media channels. Question to all of you is, how important is the trust for a society? And are there any forces at work that may bring back that trust? Kristie, do you want to pick up from there, and then we can go to Raju?
Yeah, I think I'm grateful because local news is usually at the highest of the trust level. when you rate the different medias. And I think that's because, again, some of the history of the FCC license and all of the regulation that's on us has helped that. But it needs to be better, right? We need to keep growing that. And that's something you have to prove day in and day out with your brand. But I think trust is paramount to local news and all of our news entities, because if you don't have that, you don't have a lot to go off of. So I don't know if I have the best answer on improving it and growing it, except living out your brand every single day and just trying to do the best you can. And it's not always easy.
Raju, do you see any forces at work which will bring back the trust that has dissipated over the last years?
Yeah, I think in America, those are called elections. When you have a president who publicly questions the accuracy of that country's media, it's challenging, right, for our individual brand to then say, kind of deal with that. So I think it is temporarily that we don't seem to have a president who believes that. But I think there are things that are happening that could help to restore trust. For example, I think a lot of news organizations have discovered that they haven't done a good job explaining how they do what they do, right? So you now start seeing when there's a big report, oftentimes now they're kind of starting to explain, this is what it took to do this report, this is how we did it. They're having Q&As, they're presenting a lot more kind of behind the curtain things and demystifying the process of news. And I think that goes a long way in helping build trust, because if audiences can understand what's happening, what skills go into it, what kind of professional training goes into being a journalist, I think all those things will help. Look, we forget that the Pulitzer Prizes are named after Joseph Pulitzer. They are recognized the highest quality journalism in the world, even though they're given mostly for US journalism. But they're named after a guy who ran a tabloid in New York that wholesale made up stories. It was like one of the worst, like in terms of actual truth. So if that can change, and if today's Pulitzer Prize can become a symbol of quality, I still believe that we can regain trust.
Okay, wonderful. A slightly different question. We talked a little bit about the financial model of the business of media, and different entities are trying different things, both in electronic media as well as print media. Subscription model, particularly in electronic media, seems like it's a new thing that's coming up. The streaming and subscription. Disney's had great success in signing up so many millions of people. Where do you think this trend is headed, and what is this here to stay? Is this going to be the trend of the future, or is this going to be just one of many things? Marcellus, do you want to?
Sure. I think it clearly is a trend that is going to continue and going to grow. The public is cutting the cord on the cable side at record rates, as we know. And we believe, and this is again a Scripps initiative, that people are self-bundling. They're choosing what streaming services they want to have. And because those streaming services don't tend to come with long contracts, they're typically not very expensive per month. They're being signed up, whether it's Disney Plus or Hulu, or they're just any number of them, Paramount Plus, Apple Plus. I mean, they're just a lot of them. It is clearly going to be a trend that continues to grow, in my opinion. And again, local stations are positioning themselves to be with some of those platforms, because a lot of folks, to the local strength of news that Kristie has talked about, a lot of people want and trust local news coverage. And if there's a streaming service that includes local stations in addition to their entertainment or sports or whatever, those streaming services are going to be, I believe, subscribed to more quickly than those that don't. So I do believe it's a trend that's going to continue. And again, local stations being a part of that to bring some news credibility is extremely important, because per the last conversation, in my opinion, there is no substitute when it comes to news. There's no substitute to trust. And it is being challenged every day, as you've mentioned, by people in Washington, D.C., or people who used to be in Washington, D.C.
I think we're come to the end of our allotted time, but I just want to give each of you, if you want to very quickly say something that we didn't touch upon or that has been talked about, but you want to add to it before we pass it back to Shahid.
I have just something to add to everyone that's in this program. If you would consider getting into management one day, and not just being an on-air or print journalist, but look at the people in front of you right now. You really get the ability to impact the industry and make some decisions to help send it in the right direction. So please consider management.
I have two things, and I'll pick up one on what Kristie mentioned. There's a saying that I believe firmly in, and that is, it is difficult to be that which you haven't seen. And in the space of Muslims reporting, Tahira Rahman, who I know is another part of the program, was, as I think everybody in this panel knows, was the first Muslim reporter to be allowed on a public television station, commercial station, I should say, while wearing a hijab. That example is extraordinarily important. And so I hope that the audience sees that and aspires to that, because she's been terrific. And the last comment is, I just want to thank the organization AMI for doing this, because it does expose a talented group of folks to our business, and we need more talented folks in that business. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Raju. Any parting thoughts from you?
Yeah, given that these are journalism students starting out in their careers almost or relatively young, just a couple of thoughts. One is, if you think of yourself as somebody who wants to be a print journalist or a TV journalist or a radio journalist, chances are that your career could be significantly limited by the forces of technology that are changing how people consume it. But if you think of yourself as, I can tell amazing stories, I'm curious about things, and I can translate that to a larger audience, you're going to have a very bright future, because the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Snaps, none of these companies, they're amazing platforms for virality and spreading things. They don't really create anything. End of the day, they still need creators of content, which is all of you. So despite reading how challenging it is, how hard it might be to get jobs or internships, and constantly hearing about reductions in workforce, there's never been a better time to get into the profession of storytelling.
Thank you all very much. I think we've come to the end of our time. I will, on behalf of American Muslim Institution, want to thank all the panelists. Shahid, I'm sending this back to you, and take it from here.
Thank you very much, Kesar. Thank you, Marcellus, Raju, and Kristie. We really appreciated you joining us today. Kesar, thank you so much for moderating. For the participants in our program, I really want to talk to you guys directly. This conversation should provide a framework about how the rest of the program will continue. Today, we looked at some of the opportunities and challenges in the industry. We looked at the role business plays. We looked at the role diversity plays. As you go on to the next 11 sessions, I hope you keep this framework in the back of your mind and you continuously think about it. Again, for me, and on behalf of AMI, again, we're thankful for all of you that could join us today, and also for those watching on Facebook and Zoom. And everyone have a nice day. And for this panelists, for the participants, the last thing is check out Canvas. Your evaluation form is now live. Take care, everybody. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.